Every year we have the NACS State of the Industry Summit where we talk about industry numbers and all kinds of things. And every year the program's somewhat similar. This year we're going to do something a little different. We're going to start out that first day by kind of giving people the chance to open their minds a little bit. And we're going to talk about creativity instead of business strategy. The person who will lead that conversation is joining us today. Our guest today is Tucker Bryant, and he has a extremely interesting career, first starting at Google, and eventually moving into poetry, which I guess you could think of as two entirely different skill sets, but he's the one that's going to answer that. So first off, welcome. Thanks for joining us today, Tucker.
Jeff, it's such a joy to be here, and I can't wait to get to see you hopefully in person in just a few weeks here.
Yes, you will, and it's a good crowd. It's our second biggest event. These people are thirsty for. They aren't coming there necessarily to just hear about numbers. What they're coming to hear about is what do the numbers mean? How do you act upon that? And even though it's April, it's starting the new year. How do you start new behaviors and new ideas, and how do you move them through? And so having you kick off the event by just having people think differently, because in the past, it's like, let's get right to the numbers. Let's not waste any time. Pause, think, and then the next day dive in. So let's first give us your personal journey, and we'll dive in. I have some questions specifically related to that. But as I said, you started at Google, obviously highly technical, very focused on algorithms and all those things. And then you journeyed over into poetry. And we'll talk about what poetry means, because poetry means different things to different people, and what it means to you and how it can ultimately affect business. So that's not all one big question. Tell us about your personal journey.
Yeah, I love the setup. Thank you so much. And it's funny. So before coming to Google, I was in college, discovered this thing called poetry, wrote some stuff back then, really loved it. But then when I graduated, felt like, kind of as you alluded to, these are two different skill sets, the corporate world versus the poetic world. Let me retire at the tender young age of whatever, 21 or whatever I was at that time. And so I put the poetry aside, went to work at Google, and over time...
Interrupt you already.
Please. Yeah.
How'd you wind up in engineering? Because what's interesting to me is I started as an engineer, got an engineering degree, and got an MBA, and ultimately I'm doing a journal of majors job. And the reason I got into engineering is you go to your guidance counselor once a year in high school. Maybe more if you've done something that warrants you visiting the guidance counselor more than once a year for guidance. But no, it was, well, you did well on your math SATs. You should be an engineer. And it's like, what does an engineer do? I don't know, but they do a lot of stuff with math, and you're obviously good math. Okay. Turns out I like storytelling a whole lot more, but that also involves numbers. So it's not the Jeff show. I didn't mean to interrupt the Tucker show.
No, please.
But so was there those dual tracks of engineering and creativity that you were always riding, or?
Yeah, it's interesting. I should specify. So I was at Google. I was actually working in product marketing. So I was working with engineers, working with product designers, folks of this nature. But I was kind of between those realms of the technical product expertise and then the storytelling. But it was still so different than, the way I had come to appreciate storytelling through poetry. And so for me, it was like there weren't actually these dual tracks, only because I had this false idea in my mind that you had to be one, or you had to be the other. And so I was full in on poetry when I was in college, and then I was full in on the technical, or the technology side, I should say, when I came to Google. And then at some point, I realized, and I'm curious if this is your experience too. You said it's not the Jeff show, but I want to know your takes as well. I noticed that there were all these things that poets have to do that actually draw on the proverbial left brain side of their thinking, right? You're having to think in systems in order to take a big idea and put it into a format or a style that actually makes sense. Or on the flip side, if you're in a technical position, if you're in the technology industry, you have to be able to think in a somewhat creative way in order to apply solutions that you've come up with to novel scenarios. And so it became apparent to me that these realms are actually trying to converse with each other a lot more often than we realize. And it's just having the willingness to say, actually, what would it look like to draw both of these realms into the other in order to come up with something that feels unique and interesting and disciplined, but also presenting a lot of possibility. And so it's been an interesting ride, but after a few years at Google, realizing that actually those two realms are more connected than I might have realized 3-4 years prior was when everything really started to change.
And you had mentioned creativity and the technical side are similar. And I remember when our daughter was much younger, she was a lot better at music than I am. I like listening to it. She was good at playing it, but she was talking about how there's really a connection to math in music, and music is full of creativity. But when you break it down, it's a series of progressions, and it's math, and all kinds of interesting things. And talking about how something strikes you a certain way, there's a mathematical explanation or a scientific explanation behind it. And my thing is, you really can't communicate. Numbers allow you to communicate better. I heard somebody say it once. It's like every story has to have a point, every point has to have a story. So the point
Yes.
is usually the factual part, and the story is the creative part. And you meld those two, and then you have something that really works.
Yeah, I love that take. It's this idea for me that business and all these analytical ways of thinking, they can teach us the discipline of creativity and how to do innovation. And then art, it shows us how to do it differently. You can take those systems of the circle of fifths or whatever other concepts allow us to actually use a structure that make music work. And then it's that willingness to say, okay, what's my personal interpretation of these rules that allow me to take the constraints that the mathematical system of music or of color theory, if I'm a painter, and do something that is uniquely me. And so once we have those skills, I think what the really exciting part is asking ourselves, what am I going to bring to this system now that I have the scaffolding in place? And that's a lot of the work that I really enjoy exploring with audiences.
So I'll let you define what poetry is, but I threw out that music reference, and I think it just hit me that poetry is music without instrumental accompaniment.
Mm, yeah, I like that. Yeah, I think that's real. I mean, there's so many different ways of approaching this, and a lot of people that sort of I have looked up to and respected will take the almost like circular definition of saying poetry is any piece of writing that uses poetic devices to convey its thought. Now, I agree with that, but I actually think that what's really meaningful in that definition is what's not said. And specifically, the thing that's not said that a lot of people assume has to be poetry is that definition doesn't involve words being on a page or being in a book. And I've found that for a long time, I assumed that poems had to be on a page because that's the way that I'd seen them happen. That's the way all the greats had done it, etc. But I also felt like for a lot of people, let's be honest. I'm sure a lot of your listeners are not picking up their William Wordsworth book as soon as they get off this podcast. Poetry for a lot of people is inaccessible. And I'd had all these really powerful experiences with it that I knew that, if I tried to show a person a poem that they encounter at a time when they're not in a moment of heartbreak or grief or whatever, they're not likely to have that same powerful experience. And so for me, the journey has been on what does it look like to redefine poetry outside of the book or outside of the page so that people encounter it in a context and in a way that makes it more accessible. And so I've been working on taking poems out to the sidewalk, taking them into the airport, doing them in ways that involve you have to engage in a public scavenger hunt, things like this, where the poem is not the words on the page anymore. It's just the experience you're having when you encounter those words. And that's been the creative edge. It's been really exciting for me to explore. And also, we're going to be talking about when we connect in a few weeks.
So I would imagine that the worst thing that ever happened to poetry is limericks, because it just defines like the worst, because it's something that follows a very, very tight format, usually ends with profanity. And
In the best cases.
yes. But so what you're talking about, though, is a combination of street theater. It might not be a poem that's repeated. It might be one time only and then off into the ether. So it's performance. It has a message. It may rhyme. It may not rhyme. It may be a certain number of bars. It may go on for a while. So how how does all this, the idea, the concept of poetry, well, actually, before I even get in there, because that's the second question, what is poetry?
Poetry, if I try to extrapolate beyond that definition of any piece of writing that uses poetic techniques, poetry can be an experience too. I think what we care about when we ask ourselves what poetry is the feeling that it gives to us. It's, that sense of paying attention to something that might have seemed, unimportant or just easy to miss previously, but causing us to lean in. And I think a lot of experiences can do that to us. And so I'm abstracting away in a way that, might seem kind of nebulous, but I think when we start thinking of poetry in this way, we realize actually there are lots of opportunities that I have to create poetic experiences, even if I'm not a fan of limericks or of haiku or sonnets and things of this nature. And so that's what's been really fun for me to dig into.
And thinking about the best of poetry, you'll be watching a sporting event, and somebody will say, "Well, that player is poetry in motion," and that what you've just defined is there's a fluidity, there's an experience, there's something that makes you feel better. You may not be able to put your finger on it, but you feel better, and that we all want to feel better. But if you're in business and you can make somebody feel better, you're onto something here.
100%. And I think being willing to step outside of the playbooks that, allow us to identify a best practice or a norm that's easy to follow, those things are really helpful. But allowing us to kind of mess with some of those invisible rules that we assume have to be followed all the time is often the first step that we have to connecting with that audience. Whether you're an artist or a leader, it's stepping outside of those playbooks and saying, hey, there might be some stuff we could do here that isn't necessarily precedented, but might allow for that experience or that moment that just really hits our person in the right way. I think that's when things get really fun.
So I don't want to take away anything from your presentation that you'll be giving, but how do you kind of set up for somebody who's saying, yeah, it doesn't feel right to me, that there is a way you will coach through, there's an opportunity for you that you may not be using, and it is about experience. It is about talking to somebody differently. Doesn't mean you have to rhyme. Doesn't mean you have to free form. It doesn't mean you have to do any of these things. But there's an element of this important experiential type of creativity that can affect your business and can grow your business.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think one of the first places that we have to start, because part of what I'm reading in your question is this thing that a lot of people experience of, maybe having a really solid set of principles or processes that have allowed their business or their work to thrive, and then getting really into those patterns in a way that sort of kind of keeps us in a rut. And I think one of the first things we have to do is we have to look twice at that status quo and realize that there are things that we could change. But more importantly, the exercise to go through over and over is this idea of refusing the first answer, right? Because we all encounter things in our work that trigger a default reaction. And often that reaction is just whatever we've practiced the most. And I think one of these ways to sort of blunt the skepticism people have when you come to them with this proposal of, hey, let's try things differently, is to say, look, we don't have to, throw the baby out with the bathwater or forget everything we're already experts in. But when you encounter this moment in which someone asks for a decision you know the answer to, or you're preparing to run a meeting that you've run 100 times, instead of just deferring to that first thing that comes to mind, just ask yourself, what is one other option or solution here? You don't have to follow it, and it might not be the perfect solution, but going through the exercise over and over of creating space for that second option is what allows us to realize, oh, actually, my surface area of possibility is a lot wider than I thought it was. And that path, once we get in the door with that, I think leads us towards the kinds of changes that lead to experience being really unique and really powerful. And so refusing that first answer and coming up with alternatives is really where this all begins in my mind.
I think in our industry, any industry, there's really two things that people talk about now in how do you get customers, how do you grow your business. One is AI. We'll set that aside. We're not talking about AI. Some people say I want to talk more about AI. Some people are like, I never want to hear AI again. But the other one is experience, and so we've touched upon that quite a bit in this, talking about it's about experience. And I know a lot of times that one of the new things that I like saying is, let's not talk about features, let's talk about the benefits, because too many people are like, well, I have a product. Well, what's your product? It's 12 inches by 14 inches, and it's mostly square, and it's this, and it's blue. And why should the customer buy it? Well, I want you to buy it. But then when you talk about the features or the benefits, then it's like, okay, what does it do? But then the third element is, what is the experience? What will, not necessarily as box, but what is the experience, and how do you think about something differently? And sometimes, whether it's poetry or whether it's music or whether it's comedy stand up, you workshop something and you just say, I have a phrase here. Let's set that aside. We're gonna do something with this, and it may happen when I'm mowing the lawn. It may happen when I'm driving in the morning. But we think about this enough, and we're gonna come up with some interesting ways to look at this. And I would assume that's also part of your journey that went from Google to talking to people about the language of poetry and the importance of it in communicating.
I love where you're going with this. I'm going to pull up a note on my phone because the most opened note that is on my phone, it's pinned to the top. It's called Bad Ideas. And it's the place where I put down every creative project that's ever crossed my mind when it's in its like rawest, most bizarre, often incoherent form. And so, the first three things on here say Lexicon, a conference for people named Lexi who like words. I have a party where everyone invites one person that they don't like. I have an art show around abandonment that gets really heavily marketed. And then as soon as people get there, the gallery is empty. These ideas are terrible, right? But every idea that I've ever shared with a public audience, every installation I've worked on has at some point been in that note. And part of what I'm getting and what you're saying is this truth that allowing ourselves to get these bad ideas onto the page with the trust that if we've made our ideas real in that format, they can then grow into something that is worth sharing, is what this is all about. And what this is, whether this has to do with poetry or has to do with just a change in our businesses. Because again, my interest in poetry is, it's beyond how the words communicate and more about what it's like to just take this assumption that poetry is just words and blow that out of the water. And so I think getting to a place like that requires us to start with a kind of clumsy, toddling idea that is moving in that direction, but is super imperfect. And I think it's actually pretty fun when we allow ourselves to give those bad ideas a place to play.
We, for years, have this thing at our NACS show where we get 25,000 people. We have this video series called Ideas to Go, and we showcase great ideas. We had joked that we're going to do a series called Ideas That Blow, and they're the bad ideas. And every retailer we've talked to about this, it's like, I have the first answer for you. Put me on the first episode. So there is something about taking the bad and figuring out the good. Right before we started recording today, I was on the phone with somebody, and we were talking about how do we talk positively about food in our industry, particularly around access in areas that are underserved, and played around with this line, we're for fill-ups and fill-ins. And that's not perfect, but anybody listening, let's talk about that. How do we talk about that better? There's plenty of car rides, and I'll sort that out. Maybe I'll talk to you more, Tucker. But it is that whole element of just like putting them down, working on them, having the radar attuned, and then the creativity kind of flows through that, as opposed to just kind of scheduling your life around 30-minute meetings or increments or things like that. But you also hear that some of the most innovative companies in the world almost force their leaders to take a day off and do nothing but read magazines, or do nothing but watch TV, or just allow something to possibly flow, open up new synapses and things like that.
Yeah, I think so many things you say in that really hit on resonant points for me. One is there's a speaker named Victoria LeBalm who has this idea, or she shares the phrase, "Be open to the idea that could lead to the idea," and that's what I'm hearing when I hear this idea that or this notion that you shared, that sometimes it's just about putting it out there and knowing that even if it's imperfect, probably because it's imperfect, it can then be shaped and passed around and transformed. Um, and then the other thing that you brought up, I'm forgetting because I'm getting so excited with so many ideas that you're bringing up for me, and so I forget what my second
Time
point
for
was.
creativity.
Time for creativity. Yes, yes. Thank you. I think you know we all deal with these constraints in our work of limited time, limited budget, etc. But we have to recognize that if we care about not just what we do tomorrow or next week, but what we're doing in a year or 5 years, we have to budget in a little bit of time to do that dreaming or that rejuvenation that is happening when a leader just takes the day to read magazines and watch TV, just open up to that white space. And so there's some mindset shift in recognizing that downtime as an investment in future ideas that I think we miss out on a lot. And poets know this best. They're economical with language because there's a difference between language that actually moves your art forward and language that weighs it down, or that you return to just because of how familiar it is. And so having the faith to know that removing some things actually can lead to something far better is also a really important starting point for a lot of these journeys that a lot of folks in the audience are on.
So I went to YouTube, watched some of your poetry, some of it going back quite a while when you were back at Stanford.
Had my hair, I'm sure. Whew, that was a different time.
And I know you had some industry-focused ones. One, you were talking about the fact that you didn't have a driver's license, which, not good for our industry. We sell a lot of fuel or charging. That's not a knock. That's cool. But it made me think, are there poems that you can think of that related to our industry that kind of mention something? Does a poem have to be about the heart, or can it be the internal dynamics of someone, or can it be about the heart in a business?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I'm trying to think of some that come to me offhand, and I might have to get back to you on it. But there are totally so many writers that I appreciate who do this work of kind of zooming in on the human experience, but then zooming out and framing that in this more, global or business related way. And I think part of the work here is being able to move down that ladder of abstraction with some grace. It's realizing why this matters to us and being able to take that and relate it to the broader picture that we all face when we're at work or even in our personal lives. And so, yeah, give me a chance to come back to some specific poems that touch on that theme specifically, because I know there are some, and I'm going to have to just look at my bookshelf to grab some of them out.
Okay, well, we have time. So, as I mentioned, it's a NACS State of the Industry Summit, April 14, 16. You'll be kicking things off. So, how do you envision the time you're spending with us going? Without, like I said, want to save the presentation, but people are going to walk in and then they're going to walk out. And how are they going to feel different?
My hope is that people are going to feel a lot less skeptical than I imagine a lot of them will when they walk into the room. Because if I were in their shoes, I'd walk into that session with a little bit of a question of what is the relevance of poetry to what I have to do as a leader in a high pressured and highly constrained environment? And I hope to show them that my work has been on dispelling this myth that poetry is words on a page, and sometimes it's not even actually about the words at all. That's not even what is most interesting to me these days. It's these experiences that people in the audience are creating, and the openness to realizing that the tools we can use to create those experiences are so much broader and vaster than we realize on our day-to-days. And so when people leave, I think that they'll see that if it's possible in poetry, this thousands-year-old art that, people who've been writing with their quills have had a monopoly on, if that can be disrupted, imagine what it can do, or what you can do with the tools of today that allow us to make change even faster and on an even greater scale than what writers have been doing for thousands of years. And I'm so excited to see where they take the ideas and implement them in their own work.
And one of the things that we talk about in business is there is potentially a giant sea of sameness. And when everybody essentially has the same products, the same convenience offer, or any other offer, how do you cut through the clutter? Try something different, try something new, try to stand out, and the idea could lead to the idea. And that's the whole point of that whole exercise. So thanks again for spending some time with us today, Tucker, and we really look forward to seeing you in April in Schaumburg, which is just outside of Chicago. So once again, thanks for joining us today.
I cannot wait. It's going to be a great time. Appreciate your time, Jeff.
And thank you all for listening to Convenience Matters.
Convenience Matters is brought to you by NACS and produced in partnership with Human Factor. For more information, visit convenience.org.